ground. And we want to make sure that we get you out on time. You've been doing a long day of learning, and so we want to support you in that. My name is Jeanna Capito. I'm the co-chair of the Home Visiting and Parenting Education Systems Finance Committee. And this session is focusing on the work of the Finance Committee. And while maybe not answering the question, how much does it really cost? We're going to be talking about the idea of cost and understanding how to have resource tools that support you in answering that question at both a direct service program level in the community, and that can also be used to think about community planning and statewide planning. And then we also want to talk a little bit about what other tools are available or could be made available that would support you in your work. So with that, I want to start us out with touching base on the vision for the system. We always ground ourselves in this. And as you can see, that the critical part of this vision is that all families have access to the types of supports that meet their needs. And in the concept of parenting education, or range of parenting education, that encompasses home visiting as well as parenting education programs specifically. And one of the big things from the system perspective is that it's within a coordinated delivery system aiming towards those positive outcomes for the parent-child relationship as well as child and family well-being. So everything that we are working toward is this North Star of the vision for the system. As you probably already have captured over the course of today, as well as your other work within the system, is it's no easy feat to build a system for a whole state encompassing all the home visiting and parenting education models that exist in North Carolina, and then really thinking about what authentic engagement and what types of system change needs to occur in order to advance this system. So we are thrilled by this more formal launch of the system to really engage all of you as partners in the work. The next thing I wanted to just do a quick overview is kind of what we're going to accomplish with today's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about more on the fiscal strategies and funding mechanisms work of the home visiting and parenting education system, and just sort of ensure that everybody has the same kind of working knowledge or base of knowledge on what it encompasses within the system. We want to make sure that if you're interested in the finance committee, and hopefully this presentation will get you interested in it too. If nothing else, just see kind of like how we're able to nimbly move virtual platforms in the middle of sessions and still move forward with our content. So you'll feel like that we're a group that moves on the fly, and we do the same thing when we're talking about numbers and making sure that we have answers to those questions. We want to do some education on the cost estimation model that already exists for North Carolina. And as part of that, we really want to gather your input on the model and ways in which we could improve it, as well as then talking about other resource tools that are needed as fiscal resources to do the work of building a system and supporting quality implementation of services in the community. I am joined today by Phil Redmond, who co-chairs the Finance Committee with me, and I'll let Phil introduce himself here in 1 second, but I'm also joined by Jennifer Stamp of Mecklenburg County, and Jennifer has been doing local systems building work for many years and has already begun thinking a little bit more deeply about how to use the fiscal modeling tool. So we're thrilled to have the community spotlight from Jennifer.
Thank you, Jeanna. I'm really happy to be here to share our experience from the Smart Start perspective in Mecklenburg County.
Thanks, Jennifer. And so now I'm going to ask Phil Redmond from the Duke Endowment to introduce himself and then actually take it away to tell us a little bit more about the committee.
Thank you, Jeanna. Again, let's try this again. Glad everyone can be with us this time. I'm Phil Redmond. I'm a program officer with the Duke Endowment. We have a history of funding in this space, home visiting and parent education, and have been focused primarily in the most recent few years, last 10 years or so, on the implementation support necessary for programs to really achieve the outcomes for which they were designed. I had the good fortune of co-chairing the Finance Committee with Jeanna, which has been a real honor. I've learned so much from her already and will continue to do so. We just want to take a few minutes and provide a little bit of background about the Finance Committee itself, our work, sort of ground us in the work, and then we'll get to the cost estimation tool, which I think is very exciting and look forward to introducing that to you. We think it has great potential for creating a system for children and families across North Carolina. Let me start with this first slide. Fiscal strategies is a key component of any system, whether it's home visiting or healthcare, whatever it might be. And it's a big driver for system change. As you can see from this visual, funding, financing is one of the key pillars of the work that is undergirding this creation of a home visiting and parenting education statewide system. We have to understand the real cost of programs, so then we can understand what investment is needed so that we can expand these programs in order to meet the demand, to make sure we have equitable access and opportunities for all children and families. And we can't forget that these programs, all of these programs, home visiting and parent education, cannot exist entirely on their own. The system we're trying to build and that we have in North Carolina is not about emphasizing one particular home visiting model or one parent education model over another, but it's about how we can connect all this work so that children and families have access to the programs or program they need in the community in which they live. And so the Finance Committee holds the responsibility for helping think about the strategies and to come up and to think about the financing that's needed for these programs, and not just the direct services, not just the cost of the home visitor or the parent educator or the materials, but all of the quality supports and system supports that are necessary in order for these programs to truly thrive and be successful. So, for example, what are the implementation support costs that are needed to ensure that we have confident and competent practitioners, for example? All of these costs go into building a comprehensive statewide system of home visiting parent education. Next slide, Jeanna. The fiscal strategies work is so important to the home visiting parent education system that a committee, the Finance Committee, was created for it, and we report to the collaborative board that's comprised of a multi-stakeholder group that's overseeing the development of this home visiting and parent education system. And as I mentioned, the fiscal strategies work is not just about how much does a particular program or model cost, but it's also looking at, are there ways to better leverage existing dollars? Or can we build on models for layering funds that increase services? In other words, how much do we need and where should it come from? And then how can we all work together to ensure there's an efficient administration of the funding? We want to make sure that we are not unduly burdening programs with reporting and claims and financing, that it takes away from the opportunity to actually do the work that home visitors and parent educators and executive directors and coordinators want to actually do on behalf of children and families in North Carolina. Next slide, please. Like the rest of North Carolina's home visiting parent education system, we are really, let me say you are, not just me, not we, but you are setting a path for the field with this work. North Carolina is the first state to have a cost estimation model for home visiting and parent education programs that includes every model that we know of in operation in North Carolina. And that's a lot. That's 17 distinct programs that are involved in this work, which is quite an undertaking, and also something North Carolina should be very proud of. Finance, like the rest of the home visiting parent education system that you're hearing about over the past today and tomorrow, supports the entire continuum of home visiting and parent education programs in our state. The cost estimation tool that you'll hear about shortly is just one example of systems change work that the Finance Committee is trying to undertake. And we know that our work and this cost estimation tool will continue to evolve to meet the needs of our system and communities. This estimation tool is not a distinct service or a distinct tool. It will complement and be complemented by the work of others, for example, assessment and planning. This cost tool will support our state to help us understand how much money we need to be responsive to the results of a need assessment, for example. And it will also reinforce this idea that we want to include all home visiting parent education programs in a cost estimation model, and to make sure they're available equitably across all residents of North Carolina. And in just a moment, we're going to spend some more time on this cost estimation tool, which again is an incredible tool that I think you're going to find very exciting. And I believe in my heart, you'll see the opportunity it gives North Carolina to better serve children and families in home visiting parent education programs across our state. Next slide, please. Our goal with the home visiting parent education system are many. A couple of these are noted for you on the screen here. There are two that I think this work that we're undertaking will really advance. The first is choice. To make sure, I keep making this point, but I think it bears repeating, is that we want to promote a continuum of models, a continuum of intensity, so that we have equitable access for families across the state who are seeking the services they need to better support their families. What we don't want to do is promote a model, and we don't intend to promote a particular model because it's the only one that's available in the region. This is about building a system, which I think is the other piece that this work of the Finance Committee in particular can advance, and that's around equity. Is how do we maintain and finance a system that ensures equity in terms of both capacity of providers, quality of providers, and the services that are available to all residents across the state. We know that we have a lot of work over the next few years to do. The two bullets on your screen are some of the work that's in our immediate future. But again, this is just the beginning. We aren't at the end of the work, and we know that we have more to do as we continue to move forward. Next slide, please. This slide here really talks about some of the principles that we think the Finance Committee is built on and will guide our work. And we think the work of the Finance Committee can help bring these principles to life. To make sure they are in action. So, for example, making sure that we recognize that we want to normalize this idea that all families need support. It's not just a select few or a high-risk population that needs support. All families need support. We want to normalize this idea of asking for help. And the finance can do this by making sure that we address the structural or societal or institutional inequities that sometimes don't allow families to get the support or to seek the support or ask for the support that they want. We want to make sure that all models are represented in the system. This isn't about nurse-family partnership or incredible years or healthy steps or family connects. It's about all of those programs and the 13 or 14 other programs, how they are represented and connected as part of a larger system available for children and families across the Carolinas. And we believe that the work of the Finance Committee and this statewide system will advance opportunities for more federal, state, and local investment in home visiting and parent education. That's why we're undertaking this work, is we think that finance, as a crucial part, one of the pillars, can actually help increase investment and make more equitable opportunities for families across the Carolinas, particularly in North Carolina, to access what they need when they need it. Next slide, please. The Finance Committee on the screen here there's a few bullets of the types of agencies and sectors that are represented here. We are always interested in others who have an interest in finance, who see the role that finance can play in advancing the work of home visiting and parent education. If anyone is interested in joining, please feel free to reach out. This is not a closed group. This is a working group that's trying to advance your work across North Carolina. So let me stop there so that we can get to the real reason why you're here today, and that's to learn more about the fiscal model. So thank you, guys.
Thanks, Phil. So we are going to jump into fiscal modeling. We're going to have an opportunity for input gathering using an idea board where you can put up Post-it notes. We acknowledge that technology has not been our friend in the last hour. So if any of that is not working, or if you have questions, don't hesitate to put them in the chat. Even if I'm not able to answer some of your model specific questions during the session, if you put them in the chat, we'll capture them and I'll follow up with you afterwards. But I'll try my best to keep my eye on the chat too, because we want to make sure that it's interactive and that we're hearing from you, and we're also giving you some good information about the great resource tool that's out there. So what I want to start with is a little bit of a foundation on the concept of fiscal modeling or cost estimation modeling. And I want to do this instead of jumping right into the tool that, as Phil said, was built for North Carolina and you're the first state in the country to have anything like it. So you're treading new ground for family support systems and home visiting systems as a whole. But I also wanted to give a little bit of context, particularly with all of the interest and acknowledgement and getting to understand what was embedded in Build Back Better. And while we're in a bit of a holding pattern on Build Back Better right now, the federal legislation, if you're watching and if you're sort of a student of all things prenatal to 5, you were noticing that in Build Back Better, there was a lot of language about the actual cost of childcare and how states would be required as part of that funding to set the rates that they pay for childcare based using a cost estimation model or the true cost of care. So this model that has been built for North Carolina that does direct service costs related to home visiting and parenting education program implementation is that same concept. And these are some of the core ideas of cost estimation modeling. The terms are fairly interchangeable. I used fiscal model, and we generally refer to yours as a fiscal model versus just calling it a cost estimation model. And that's in part because right now your model does estimate cost, but phase 2 of the model is designed to include revenue options in there too. So then it would become revenue and expense or more of a fiscal model. So I'm going to kind of just ask you for a little bit of grace on moving in and out of the different terms, because I'm doing that intentionally in order to support sort of getting to understand this concept of a fiscal model or a resource tool. And some of what is why it's such a great opportunity to understand, one, that North Carolina has this resource for planning and for thinking about what it actually costs to deliver the programs, and think about how with multiple home visiting programs, multiple parenting education programs in the same community or the same region, what the total cost is for that sort of continuum or system of care for families. It also is in step with what your peers and other elements of the prenatal to 5 world are using and thinking about, in the sense that childcare is doing this very same thing, really understanding that in previous worlds, we often have information that tells us what is being paid for a service. It doesn't actually tell us what that service costs. And that's a significant disconnect. And so that's why I wanted to share some of this information with you. And the way the cost estimation model works is it does allow us to understand the costs at different levels of quality or different program types. It also allows us to understand the impact of things like how many children are served, the geographic region of the state that the program's in, if we have geographic data informing it. And that's another growth that we can have within the model. It also is when you have revenue data in there, and even when you don't have revenue data in the model itself, you definitely can start to map the gap and understand the gap between the cost and the revenues that are available. You don't have to have a tool that does that to be able to take the cost per child information and then look at what's paid for that service and see if there's a gap between the two. We can do that as your cost model already allows for that. And that overall, part of what we're really trying to do with these types of tools is to support decision makers, not just policymakers, but local decision makers, local leaders as well, in really understanding what the costs are associated with the services that you're currently delivering in your communities and those you may be interested in bringing to your community, in order to plan for and invest in them correctly, and so that you can achieve what you're trying to with the services. I like to share and point out this little blue box there at the bottom, because this goes to that core concept of, particularly in the childcare world, there's the price of childcare, which is very different than what it actually costs to deliver it. It costs a lot more money to deliver childcare than the price that families can pay for it. This is no different in home visiting and parenting education, that the amount of money that you receive in a contract does not necessarily reflect the full cost to your program to deliver that service. And having a cost model that does work on true cost of service is supporting you in moving to that place of really being able to speak to what it costs to deliver the services so that we can be ensuring that, again, we're thinking about investment that meets those costs. Part of this, the other piece that I just wanted to kind of share a little bit about is this idea of what we are setting out to do with the fiscal model and the approach that we use to go about it. And we use this kind of best practice format. And this, again, is something that's being used nationally in all prenatal to 5 cost modeling for any sorts of services and meets the federal requirements related to all childcare funding. So we are in step with our childcare partners in thinking about this. And many of you were involved in this process at some point early on, probably all the way back to 2019, when we were talking about understanding, so engaging stakeholders and talking about the model, what should the model do, collecting data from programs to have that good cost data that would then give us the true cost of the service versus just what a contract or a grant amount pays for the service, and then actually building the model itself. And then we're sort of always in the running scenarios phase of developing a model, because we have this opportunity with the model in existence to run all different sorts of scenarios and understand what the makeup of the cost is depending on what programs are being delivered. We also are in somewhat of a feedback cycle all the time around all the steps of it. This meeting is a great example of continuing to engage stakeholders, to hear from you more about what else you would like to see the cost model do, and then to go forward and further develop the model following your input and advice and kind of helping to grow it and continuing to strengthen it for the state. So I shared this particular slide because I wanted to kind of demonstrate that these steps in developing a cost model really are, in a positive way, cyclical. We don't kind of give up on this as in improving your model over the course of time. So to talk quickly about sort of the purpose for the model and the goal, as I mentioned before, it's really thinking about this idea of a continuum of models, home visiting and parenting ed models in this instance, in a community versus a what does one model cost compared to another? How do I choose the least expensive program? That's not what this model is for. It's not just to say that to set a rate to pay for a model, but it's more about trying to understand the cost of having multiple programs in the community in order to meet the needs of the families in that community, and acknowledging, to Phil's point, that the system needs multiple types of home visiting and parenting education programs, because one model of either home visiting or parenting ed is not going to meet the needs of every single family. You need that complement or that sort of system of care of models in your local community. And that's what this fiscal model was built to support, is that sort of belief. And it's designed that it can be used at the individual community levels. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a bit here with Jennifer's community spotlight. But then it also can be used to think about the state as a whole and really pull it all together and say, if we were saturating with home visiting and parenting education at the level that we want to be in North Carolina, or we want to be in 5 years, how much would it cost, and kind of what's that big number? So there's an opportunity that can answer some of those big number questions too when you think about advocacy. In line with those steps that I laid out for developing a model, we did these things as part of building the North Carolina model. We really talked about the idea of the fact that just looking at grants or contracts wouldn't tell us the whole picture, that we really needed to have data collected from providers and programs that are delivering the home visiting and parenting education services in order to understand costs of programs and have that cost information inform the model. We really wanted to make sure that through that process that we had a real diversity of places in the state, geographic diversity, as well as program diversity. So the models that are delivered by your sites, as well as also the organizations that deliver the models, because we know that a small nonprofit and a health department have different costs, and we wanted to capture a lot of different cost data to understand that. And as I mentioned, revenue data on the other side is kind of our phase 2, as far as continuing to build out the model. And so we're going to get into kind of the fun part here where you get to see it in action. We wisely determined that before today's session, I would be ready with actual snapshots of the model versus taking you into it live. And again, given our experience with tech so far, I'm not going to attempt to take you to the model live. I'm happy anytime to walk folks through that if you want to see how it functions on the live side, but we're going to see screenshots of it. And what we're going to start with is the inputs, because this hopefully will start to all the ideas that I just shared around what the model can be, and the fact that it's not about home visiting programs competing, which one's the cheapest, that's not what we're aiming for. Hopefully that'll be all a little bit clearer when you see how the model actually works. So the first thing that you have to do in the world of the inputs is you have to select the models that you want to deliver, or that you want, the scenario you want to run. So which home visiting and parenting education models, which, as Phil said, we have all the ones in North Carolina listed in the model, and we will continue to add to it as any new models get added to the state. You pick those, and then you also have to enter the number of children or families that each model will deliver in the scenario that you're running. Doesn't have to be an unduplicated number. So if you're modeling Family Connects, for instance, in your community, and you know that there's 3,000 births in a year, you're going to put 3,000 next to Family Connects, and you also will have some of those 3,000 be served by other programs as well. So you don't have to have an unduplicated number of children and families served. It says children and families because we know that some models, the caseload is families, and some, the caseload is children. So we're trying to allow for those variances across. And then we also acknowledge that not all models require group services. So we do have the allowance that you can elect for group services as part of the scenario, which would then change the cost profile if you operate a model that is not required to do group services. And so, not to get too much in the weeds, I'm going to take you to the next screen so you can be looking at what the actual input page looks like while I explain that a little bit more. But for instance, if you're an early Head Start home-based program, you are required to do group socialization. You do that twice a month, and that is part of your model. You would not put in group services in those blue shaded columns because it's already built into your model expenses. So in this instance, if you're modeling early Head Start, when you put in the number of children to be served, the expense information that's going to get spit out at the end when the model is done running is going to include the cost of running group services as well. If you're a if you want to model healthy families, which does not require group services, it does recommend it, but it doesn't require it. But you want to understand how much it would cost to run healthy families, say with or without group services, you can put that into that blue shaded column and you can get that answer because you've selected no group services and then you opt in for group services. So that's an example of running a different scenario within the model. And right now, the screen, the snapshot there that you're looking at is the actual input page in the model. That's exactly the way the input tab looks. This snapshot's a little bit old, so I'm not going to guarantee that all my models are listed there. So if we're missing somebody, we might be missing somebody in parenting ed. My apologies if we're missing anyone, but this is an older snapshot of how the model functions. And this is the most important page of it, is you make those selections around the number of children that you want to model the scenario and you want to understand, and which different service models you're trying to understand based on maybe the community profile. So if you have a community with large population of adolescent parents, then maybe you're picking programs that are designed and that there's evidence-based to say that they make a stronger impact on adolescent parents in that community. Then after you do that, and we are going to look at an output, but first I want to walk you through sort of what the output page is going to tell us. What the output is going to do is it functions on an annual cost. So it's estimated annual cost based again on the models that you selected and driven by the number of children or families that you put in that first column on the input page. It's going to then give you the cost to operate those models for a year, both the personnel and non-personnel expense lines. It's also, as part of the output page, summarizes what you picked. So you don't have to go back to that first input tab. On the output page, it's going to tell you how many children total you put in the scenario you were going to be trying to serve, which programs you were using to serve the children. And then it summarizes some other things such as the number of home visitors, the total personnel line, not by model, but just the total personnel line of all the home visitors and parent educators in the scenario that you ran. Some of the information that can often be really helpful to understand that kind of what's the workforce that we're looking at to serve that many children and families, kind of having that number as a whole. That all comes together on the output page. So let's take a look at an output page sort of in action. Hopefully this is big enough on the screen. When you get the slides, you can zoom in a little bit too, but you see exactly what I sort of talked you through there. Based on the selections that we put in the front page, this scenario is going to serve 2,500 2,504 children, oddly specific amount of children are being served with this particular scenario. The total cost for this community or region, kind of depending on what geographic area the children and families live in, is just under 8.1 million. Of that, and this is across all the models that were selected, the percentage of personnel of that total budget is 85%. So this really reinforces that it's the workforce that is where the cost comes for our programs. And then you see an average cost per child across all the programs. That's this like third or fourth line down, the 32. So it's just over 3,000. Now that's an average cost. If you look down here at the programs that were included in our scenario, it did include adolescent parenting program. It included Family Connects. It included Nurse Family Partnership, Parent Child Plus. So some of these programs are much more intensive and cost much more per child. And some, like Family Connects or say the Incredible Years program, cost less per child because they have a lower intensity. And again, this goes to this idea of how important the continuum is of services in a community, not saying that one service or another is better or stronger, but instead really understanding what is the need of the community that you're serving and how do you match that need. And so this is just one potential scenario of different programs. There's a lot of programs in this community, obviously, and you see kind of a pretty big ticket price there at just coming in under 8.1 million. So this is not a cheap service delivery, but again, what we're trying to reinforce is we're serving 2,500 children and families with all of these different programs and meeting a variety of different families' needs by having all these different programs. I'm going to pause here quick and see if I can take a quick look at the chat and see if there's anything else that I can maybe speak to. But I see also that folks are helping out and answering. Thank you, system partners, for taking the opportunity to speak to each other in the chat. I appreciate that. So I talked a little bit about this already by model output, so I'm going to go pretty quickly because, like I said, I want to move us to a little bit more feedback from you. But the biggest thing around here is that, like, this is not a childcare model and that it's just here to set a rate. While it helps you understand what the cost per child is annually for a given type of home visiting or parenting education program, it also helps you to understand the whole, that answer to that question. If I had multiple programs in my community, what's the whole profile? There is a tab in the model, which I didn't do a snapshot of, that also shows those cost per child information, but does it by each model that was selected. So you would see exactly how much Family Connects cost per child compared to Parents as Teachers or Nurse Family Partnership. But again, that's not there so much to compare programs, but just to understand that naturally there's a difference in intensity, so there's a difference in cost. And then that summary page that we were just looking at kind of puts it all together as a whole to understand a state or the community budget in that particular instance. So with that quick snapshot, I want to pause and hear a little bit from you. I want to hear a little bit on this idea of how you might see yourself using this, or what other answers related to cost would you want to have access to. And it's just sort of brainstorming anything that strikes you. We're going to attempt to put a link to an idea board in the chat that then you could go post ideas. If the idea board is not working, then we're just going to encourage you to put your thoughts in the chat and we'll capture them that way. Just a little harder to see each other's thoughts in the chat. While we're waiting for the link to the idea board to come into the chat, I want to note that what Andrea raised there, the last question in the chat, is a great one and is part of actually some of what we know that the system needs, the idea of the implementation support for the various models, and acknowledging that some of that implementation support may be held at the National Service Office in the case of some of the home visiting models, or at the state level, depending on how you implement a given model. Like HVPE has got more support at the state level in North Carolina. And so we have to acknowledge the differences in that, and then really think about how do we ensure that we understand what quality support or implementation support looks like, that we're not just costing out direct services. So that is a great question. And that is exactly the type of thinking that we are working on and want to hear more from you on. Like, what does that implementation support look like locally? What sort of costs do you take on locally? And how do we help bring that in to the system activities as well? So the question on salaries is that Yep, there is variation across the state. And so what we did is data collection across the state to really understand what the variation looks like. This also becomes another opportunity for sort of systems building or systems change, is sort of to determine if we're doing the same job and there's certain qualifications or expectations and requirements of the individual doing the job, then should we be looking at salary scales and sort of expected amounts that individuals are paid, or a living wage minimum that everyone is paid in order to do the job? So kind of level out some of those variances that you probably find within the state, and acknowledge that it's not like you can just get it cheaper somewhere else in the state, that we really need to be thoughtful about what do we expect of the individual, and that the job isn't necessarily different across the different parts of the state. And so we want to understand some of that as well. Yep, and regarding, while I'm pulling up the idea board link, I just wanted to note that, yep, regarding the idea of model fidelity, that is one of the ways that the tool is built, is that all the features of what's required of you of the model, so caseload size, supervisor to home visitor, parent educator, all of those things are also built into the model. So that's how the variances and cost come into play too, is that different models have different expectations around fidelity to the evidence-based practices. All right, so I'm just working on here, getting the idea board link to put into the chat so that you can share some of your thoughts with each other too around how you could use the tool and what other types of questions you'd want answered in the tool. One thing that your tool currently does not do is as much on the regional variation. We sort of leveled out the regional variations that we received. We didn't get huge variances in salary data from the programs that we collected data from. There were some, but not huge variances. So there are not regional versions of the model right now. It could be. We could make it so that on that input page, you'd pick which region of the state you were in first, and we'd have to determine how we broke down the regions. And then after you pick the region, that would then determine what sorts of salary and non-personnel expense data was used to calculate the cost per child. So that's something we could certainly do if we thought there was strong enough differences in region. All right, so you should see the link to the idea board in the chat. So if you have an opportunity and want to go out and consider putting some of those, like how do you see yourself using the tool and what other cost answers do you need? But I also see that folks are putting some great things in the chat too that are answer those very questions. Given that we lost a little time at the beginning, I am going to keep the idea board open to see additional thoughts on the cost model itself. But I do want to turn it over to Jennifer Stamp to speak a little bit more from the community perspective around using a tool like this, maybe speaking a little bit to even one of those questions on that idea of community data and how you would use community data as well, to just highlight how this can move into practice, so that then we can hear a little bit more from you all on, after hearing Jennifer reflect, what does it spark for you?
Hi, thank you, Jeanna. From our perspective here in Mecklenburg County, we have at least 14, between 14 and 15,000 babies born every year in our community. So when we're thinking about providing healthy births and thinking about that across the system, it takes this tool to kind of, I think I can't stress enough, looking at the tool across all aspects, across the spectrum, but also I can't stress enough that it can't be used without an idea of your needs. If you are, like we are convening in our community around certain issues that we really want to address, and we want, and so we've come up with ways to isolate our needs, and we pull in the tool around home visiting and parent education because it's going to help us answer questions around cost, but also looking at individually. If I go a little bit deeper with Smart Start as a funder, it helps us look at some of the equity issues. It helps us look at, looking at, well, we know one program has a cost for training around this amount. So we want to be able to support our programs where they are And I think for funders, from that perspective, I believe that sort of transparency is really useful. So we just recently did a landscape study of prenatal to 3 services in our community. We mapped them, and which is a planning tool that we need to align with the fiscal modeling tool. I don't see us really using it in isolation or in a vacuum. It has to happen around conversations, around those system pieces. I don't know, there's some questions here.
I was also just responding to Blair regarding the setting of salaries. So that was partly me there in the chat. Yeah. And I think that Blair raises a concern, is that we have historically had what can we get for the least sort of mentality, right? In all forms of doing human services, early care and ed, family support, because the budget's always an issue. And if we have to move to a mentality of purchasing what we need to serve children and families, because unfortunately the reality is when we purchase possibly what looks the least expensive on paper, if we know its outcomes are not as likely to really benefit the population that you're trying to serve, then the public investment isn't going to achieve what we're trying to achieve for those children and families. So in the end, it's actually penny wise, pound foolish sort of thinking, right? Versus really investing in what we need to invest in. But that is a culture change that we need to move towards, is understanding, not just looking at that bottom line, but understanding why a program costs what it costs and the impact that program can have in the families it can benefit, right? Like tie all those things together when we make decisions.
And I know that I know there's some comments around the cost of living, and I think that is important. And from my perspective, using that tool, but also looking at our cost of living in our community, how can we apply that to this tool? The reality of what it costs to live in Mecklenburg County, the reality, and also pulling back if we want to explore universal home visiting as a model. How many nurses do you need? What is the pipeline? I mean, it just kind of sets up ways to answer questions and drive conversation.
Jennifer, do you want to speak a little bit about maybe even just assessment and planning? When I see Elizabeth's question there about knowing what we need, right? Like that is one of the system pieces of how this all comes together. You're right, that not every family or not every community necessarily needs a program like Nurse Family Partnership. There might be other things in play that meet families' needs. And how do you have the data to make those sorts of decisions, right? And do good planning.
Yes, thank you, Elizabeth. She's my coworker. Yeah, so the needs assessment is really, really critical. And as sort of an example of that, through our prenatal 3 study, but also thinking about the home visiting parent education work, we have a planning and assessment committee. And within that committee, I'm part of this work. We are building a data collection model that can match what your needs would be in your community. It's in Tableau, and it's a way to enter numbers of home visitors that are employed by parents as teachers from this agency and this organization. What numbers of children do you have? Breakdown of zip codes. I mean, it helps us dig. I really think it helps us create a mindset of digging deeper. But I do have to say that the needs planning and assessment work that is going on, and we're just kind of getting started in November, and we'll have more to come, but we are building that piece out to help match, here are your needs, here's some costs, let's have a conversation.
one of the other things that this struck us in really thinking about what's next for the system is clearly there's opportunities for improving and strengthening the current cost model for the direct services, but then there's the opportunity to build other resource tools. And so we want to talk a little bit about what some of those may look like, or even just what questions we're trying to answer, because then that would help us to think about whether or not how that would look, what that would look like as a system resource tool, and how we can meet the needs. I know one of the things that Jennifer and I spoke about recently was the idea of, I don't want to call it fiscal mapping because that has a certain, right, folks might think a certain thing, but more of what fiscal mapping often does, which tells you where the funding is, what the funding can be used for, and helps to understand sort of what's available and not available in the community. How do we make something like that could tie to the cost model, right? So that you could understand, because not all funding's created equal. Not all funding can be used to do all the same things, right? So we need to have a little bit of that understanding to even go to combo those things together to say, if here's how much it's going to cost us to serve families with a service model, or the multiple service models we're trying to put into place in our community, what sort of is the universe of funding? Maybe some of it we're already using, some of it we're not. Some of the stuff we're not using can't be used for what we're trying to do anyways. Like, and just sort of sometimes maybe clear out some of the noise around this idea that there's all this funding out there. Are we drawing down what we should be? And really help to focus your efforts. And that was something I know that Jennifer was thinking some about what that might look like in Mecklenburg and how we can build a resource tool that would be useful for you all.
Mm-hmm. I mean, home visiting parent ed is just one piece of our whole early childhood system. So I see this tool and this work as being a part of the mapping of cost and of revenue. It's a piece of it. So we can talk about childcare. We can talk about home visiting parent education. We can talk about early intervention. So it's part of this map that we're trying to build around here are our families, what do we need, how do we get it, what's the best way to do this in a way that is equitable and that respects cost of living. I think that is so critical. I don't want to go, I think you talked about this, Jeanna, of, oh, let's just go, there's this mentality somewhere around, well, it's the cheapest, and that's not workable, that we don't get results from that.
So I was thinking about and responding to some of the chat dialogue around the idea of screening and matching families with services, which are certainly a form of also having better data and understanding what families need, and also knowing when you don't have anywhere that meets the needs of a family. And so it's sort of you're by that aspect of not being able to refer or connect, you have an element of where you're hearing, okay, then we need to think about how are we going to meet these families' needs. And so we can build almost anything into any cost model. So that's not my hesitation. My thought is, how do we make sure if we build in, because we could cost model out screening costs, right? Like that's community-based screening, and some of the programs that are even on your list, like Family Connects, that's kind of inherent to what they do, right? So they're in there. But I think we also all need to be thinking about, and I believe that Diane was sort of raising that with her last post in the chat, is that there are other resources within communities, right? That home visiting and parenting education are nested within a whole host of other things in communities. Some of those other resources may be screening families, connecting them to services. So we want to sort of acknowledge that. I guess we need to think a little bit as a group around what would be costing with the screening. Would we be costing the idea that it needs to occur in order to ensure families are matched up with what exists? And if you don't have anything in place, maybe you look at a Family Connects model, because that could fill that void for you. Or if you do have those resources in place in your community, then how do you fund them well enough to function as a screener to get families to lots of different services? Because sometimes folks do that kind of for their own program, but maybe don't have the capacity to send families much more than just knowing whether they can serve them or not and send them on to something else. So there's a way to maybe think about how do we just make sure that the value of a point of entry for families into services is part of every community, and what does that cost to have that activity occurring? So there's a little bit there to that idea of like what else a screening tool could be, and how, to be clear, not developmental screening, but screening families and linking them with services, and how would we build that into right. How would we build that into a cost model in a way that met what you were trying to do as communities? Is what I'm kind of thinking through. Any other sorts of questions that you'd like to have answered? Fiscal questions, cost related questions? Any sort of thoughts on what you would need at the community level to use a tool like this? What support?
We allowed to come off mute
Yeah.
and just ask. It's easier than typing it into the chat. I guess one of the questions that I have is there a way, or will you guys be building in like the long-term benefit of these programs, within the model, because it's going to take advocating for additional funds to be able to stand these programs up. They're not always inexpensive to offer. And what we see is sort of a wrong pockets problem, in that we pay for it here, but we don't realize the sort of the savings until years later. And so, just thinking that if there's a way that can be incorporated into it, it would certainly make it easier to stand up an argument to the county commission or whoever else you're locally, you're taking your requests to.
Yep. It's something from the early days of even thinking about the system that has come up, is this idea of, in some ways, it's kind of return on investment. I appreciate that what you're raising and sort of what was put in the chat, because there was a chat comment that was real similar to that. Is more than that. It's that idea of what is the cost of not having it. So it's not just the benefit of the investment, but also the impact if we don't have it. And tying those together. There's one state in particular who's done more of that side of having sort of the economic analysis of the program or not having the program. And what we'd always hoped that we would be able to do is sort of tie this like fiscal modeling and understanding planning and seeking more investment with information like that economic analysis, to present both sides of it. Or there's probably more than even two sides of this coin, to say the least, but that we did see that those would be really important things. So you raising that up again as a group really helps to think a little bit about priority too right now for next steps. That economic analysis could be a really important next step for the system. I really appreciate that.
We start working on that.
Yeah, I don't have the answer yet today,
No.
by any means. But I didn't want you to think that it hadn't come up. And sometimes it's hard, right? Because it's like, well, there's a lot of different pieces of the work to do, and where do you start and what do you prioritize? But I think that you've got a lot of really smart minds in your state too, that I think economic analysis is something that we could even have at the kind of lightest or broadest sense right now to help fill in that picture a little bit more. So one of the other things, and I'll just kind of wrap up with answering Alicia's question that's in the chat, and we can point you to, I'm trying to think which slide deck it was. There's a couple of resources with mapping of how home visiting programs in particular compared to need, and where there's areas of more saturation versus less services. I probably would say that there's not an area of the state that would say they have a surplus, like programs, caseloads going unfilled. Things obviously look a little different with the pandemic. And I know there's been examples, huge variance in trying to fill caseloads during the pandemic, where some programs have found it easier and others have found it harder because they haven't been able to go to their kind of traditional in-person activities that they would go to. So there's some variance there, obviously, but you do see that there's certain areas of the state that have more programming, but they're still not over their capacity or over the number of families that could use it. But then there are areas of your state that are very underserved by home visiting or parenting education. Rachel, why don't we just make a note of that for follow-up? Because we've got some of those, like, I don't want to call them heat maps, but that's kind of what they are when you look at the like saturation and the colors darker when there's more saturated than other areas of the state.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And it does have that tie to, Elizabeth, that idea of like how many children there actually are in the area too, right? Compared to the amount of home visiting programming. That's something that the Jordan Center at UNC did, that actually was one of the reasons it kind of started the system building. And it's something that they've also continued to maintain and are working on for parenting ed right now too. So more of those.
Yeah,
resources.
I'm actually looking for the paper itself, so I can see if I can put a link in the chat.
Okay.
So I'll just put a link to the institute itself, the institute work on home visiting, and you can look through some of their resources that they have. There's a lot of great information there.
And then watch
So there's that link in the
assessment
chat.
and planning committee with Jennifer co-chairs. So keep your eye on assessment and planning and support that group to continue that work on data and making data available and helping folks with the capacity to use data too. Well, thank you all. We are just a minute past. I don't want to keep you any longer since you've been on 2 platforms to spend this hour and 15 minutes with us. We really appreciate your patience this afternoon and your interest in the topic. And we hope you'll think about joining the finance committee or whichever committee of the system really strikes you the most as where your system work should happen. We look forward to seeing you.
Well, thank you to Jeanna and Jennifer and Phil for a great session. Thank you all for your patience as we managed all the technology issues, but so glad that we could get everyone together here on Zoom. I put the link in the chat to the survey for this session, so please let us know what you learned and what you'd like to know more of. And we look forward to seeing you tomorrow and some more great sessions and great learning for the next day. So thank you all, and please reach out again to special events at smartstart.org if you have any questions.